Well, thank you everyone for coming to the Barraquer lecture. I mean, it is such a highlight at the annual Academy meeting. So just some quick housekeeping rules or items. You know, we really want this to be an interactive session, but there's 30 minutes towards the end where we will allow for discussion, and with Dr. Reinstein, we certainly want to get insights and pearls and dig in there. So we have microphones here as well as the AAO app. Please text your questions in. And then, so it is my distinct honor to be able to introduce Dr. Professor Dan Reinstein. He, we all know, is a world-renowned ophthalmic surgeon, but additionally, you know, there's so many wonderful things that we can describe Professor Reinstein. He's an accomplished pioneer, truly, an inventor, but by day, that's what he does. But by night, he is a professional level jazz saxophonist. He is the medical director of London Vision Clinic and holds positions as a board certified refractive ophthalmologist and cornea specialist in the UK, US, as well as Canada. He's an associate professor at the Sorbonne University in Paris, and with a career spanning both cutting-edge advancements in laser eye surgery and therapeutic vision correction, Dan is mainly known for, as well as pioneering very high-frequency digital ultrasound in ophthalmology, which has now developed into the ARC scan, and that was something that he started when he was in one of his fellowships. So through this work, he has also introduced the relevance of the epithelium for refractive surgery, which I am honored to be able to refer to as the Reinstein laws of epithelial compensation. And that is so important to us, especially as we are thinking about how we rule in and rule out patients for refractive surgery. And in refractive surgery, Dan has played such a fundamental role in developing both SMILE as well as Presbyopia. Educated at Cambridge University and having completed extensive postdoctoral fellowships, including a refractive surgical fellowship in 1997 under Dr. Zaldivar as well as Dr. Barraquer, it is so befitting for Dr. Reinstein to be giving the named Barraquer lecture. So when Dan is not playing when he's not operating or teaching, he's also playing the jazz saxophone at the 606 Club, which you can find him in Chelsea, London, for the patrons there, as well as for his invited patients. He's also, as you know, a prolific international speaker, and he's given over 1,200 lectures. He's also published textbooks on SMILE and authored over 200 peer-reviewed manuscripts. And on a personal level, he has 3 beautiful children, and he lives in central London. And without further ado, allow me to introduce to the podium Professor Dan Reinstein.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It sounds exhausting. Of course, my financial disclosures all apply to this lecture. Let's have a look at the previous awardees here. And some of you who are in the audience, Yanni Balikaris, for example. You know, this lecture, this award is given to people often who have made a contribution early in their career, and as a way of encouraging them, you know, to continue producing in the future. It's also given to people who are, you know, towards the end of their career and have perhaps given and made some major contributions to the field, perhaps as a way of thanking them and encouraging them to move on and retire. In my case, I'm really looking forward to seeing what the rest of my career will pan out as and what else I can possibly do for our specialty. So, in thinking about how to couch my hero, one of my heroes, José Ignacio Barraquer, I tried to, it's a very long title, but I tried to combine all of the elements of what we would call I would call the quintessential clinician, scientist, and teacher. And so I'm going to go through obviously it's impossible to summarize 200 publications, but I am going to go through areas that of research which were particularly difficult to get through, and which I am if I can say, proud to have achieved some small steps in. First of all, as Elizabeth mentioned, the epithelium. And it's funny how this started, because I, in London, finishing medical school, had to do a thesis. And I wrote, I noticed, I thought, well, I want to do ophthalmology. I like physics, lasers. Oh, so I searched lasers and eye. And a lot of publications came up with this chap, Professor John Marshall. So I phoned his lab, because he's in London. And I spoke to his fellow at the time. And I asked him to send me some reference. I received an envelope with a bunch of references. The young ones here don't understand what that means, but in the post with a stamp. And I wrote this dissertation. And then I thought, well, okay, this is starting to look like something I'd like to pursue. And out of the blue, I wrote to Alan Bird, and I asked him if I could come and chat to him about possibly going to the States and coming back to the UK. He wrote a very lovely reference for me to go to the US. And I started a research fellowship in Jack Coleman's lab, really under Ron Silverman and Mark Rondeau. And Ron is a professor of computer science, and they were using this high-frequency ultrasound transducer, the first time that were high-frequency ultrasound transducers introduced into ophthalmology. And they were using it to look at tumors and doing spectral analysis and trying to analyze the structure of tumors to determine lethality without having to do a biopsy. And I was actually encouraged to get onto these projects. We had some rabbit studies. But one night I stayed late, and I started scanning a formalin, a rabbit eye that was in formalin. And I was scanning the optic nerve and the sclera, and I was just scanning all over the place, and I scanned the cornea. And I got this scan. And the next morning, I went around the corner to the clinical area. I was, using a VAX with, line code to display the images. And I went around to Cal Roberts, and he was a professor of cornea at the time. And I said, Dr. Roberts, I'm a research fellow here. Can I show you something in the lab? And he said, sure, of course. He came very kindly, came around to the lab. I sat down, displayed the image. And he said, I said, well, over here we're looking at the front and the back of the cornea. And I think these two lines are the front and back of the epithelium. And we're able to measure it with 1 micron precision. Do you think that would be of use for something? And he went like this. No. And it was like, what, The Simpsons, it's like the sky opened up. And I was like, oh, I can't believe this. I'm a pre-residency research fellow as a foreign graduate trying to come back to the States. And I just found something that the professor of cornea at Cornell thinks is useless. I immediately went to search and found that there were no publications other than one 10 years before by Professor Brian Holden, who was using a picometer with magnification to measure epithelium to look at epithelial edema in overnight contact lens wear in 1981, 10 years before. Not one other publication. So I thought, this is it. This is my ticket. Possibly. I published the first paper and sent images over to, well, actually Jack Coleman sent the images over to Steve Troquel. They were residents together at Columbia. And I got a phone call from Steve. And he's like, hi, hey, Dan, I'm looking at these images. What am I looking at here? And I said, well, we're looking at the front and back of the cornea, and the front two lines is the epithelium. And I can't repeat what he said. It was really profane, but it was a bit shocking, actually. But, everyone knows Steve. And I said, well, that's fine. But he says, I'm sending you a patient tomorrow. I said, no, we've only scanned rabbits. He goes, that's okay. I'm sending you a patient tomorrow. 2 o'clock, be ready. Furiously cleaning the rabbit hair off the bed and making sure that everything was okay. This patient was in the phase 2 FDA trial and had this topography after her PRK. And it took me about 3 months to produce this map because I had to analyze every line individually, painstakingly, enter them into Excel, find a plotting program, and correlated the fact that the bump had thinner epithelium and there was thicker epithelium around it. And interestingly, not that I was aware of this at the time, physics then realized that there was this plume effect, and so they added extra pulses, about a -2 and a 3 millimeter zone in the middle, and they patented it. And well, they didn't put my name on it, but I did get a thank you card. No, I didn't. No, I didn't. But the guy that actually, I was presenting at meetings, and I was chasing, I was like, excuse me, Dr. Waring, could I speak to you? And he goes, follow me. You remember that? And he's got long legs. And I was like trying to keep up, and I had these printouts. I go, yeah, well, I've got these cornea scans from the rabbit. And he's like, that's amazing. You should keep on doing that. You know what that means when someone of that stature says that to a young investigator? And well, the long story short, this led to a prototype, which I built with Ron, which I took to Vancouver, which then led to us investing in a first commercial prototype, which lasted 20 years. I had it in London for many years. A second version, miniaturized, which didn't work. And finally, the bee's knees scanner on the planet of high-frequency ultrasound, which is FDA and CE marked, and it's all over the place in China. One of the main features of this idea was to combine an optical image with the ultrasound image so that you knew where you were when you were scanning. And that's important for refractive surgery because where you are determines the optics. So that was a critical component. And of course, the same thing with being able to do anterior segment scans, knowing where you are. So the biggest application that came out first was this idea of using this discrepancy between what is the normal profile of the human cornea, of the epithelium, and the keratoconic profile, and then to exploit the difference, but to exploit it at the most difficult point, which is when the topography and the tomography are equivocal. And it's very easy to use epithelium to distinguish a keratoconic eye from a normal, but what about the ones that kind of look normal and you're not sure? And here's the quintessential example from an MS-39 of severe inferior steepening, but it's accompanied by thicker epithelium. Impossible for that to be a cone, and therefore instantaneously excluding keratoconus. And Ron and I got an R1 grant and worked on what was, now it's called AI, but it was really, Ron was a professor of computer science and was in neural networks from the 70s and 80s with Coleman doing tumor analysis. So we applied this, with a huge number of variables, and we got extraordinary sensitivity and specificity for detecting keratoconus just with the epithelium. So if you had no other device and you were only doing the epithelial map, you've had an extremely high specificity and a very high sensitivity for picking up keratoconus. Here's an example of what I mean. So this is a hyperopic eye, 2012 best corrected, flat cornea with a completely normal bad D. But the epithelial map reveals a donut shape, and that donut shape is exactly the same shape as the very mild posterior change. And the algorithm, of course, classifies this really as, significant keratoconus, hiding under the topography, which is masking the cone of the front surface of the stroma. So avoiding this ectasia without a cause becomes a matter of doing an epithelial map, because all of these corneas avoided having LASIK. And of course, it will reduce the chances of you getting ectasia by a significant amount. But more importantly, commercially, I didn't realize, was to find cases where the machine makes it difficult for you to do corneal refractive surgery with this in the record, and proving that it's not keratoconus with an epithelial map. And so we did a study which, you could say quite bold, because we did hand-cytome LASIK on, we started with 1,500 consecutive eyes that were screened with a back surface and a front surface, from which we determined and went straight to surgery in 90%, but there was about 10% who we thought were equivocal. And of those, they had the epithelial maps, and 16% were true keratoconics, but 84% we excluded keratoconus and did hand-to-tome LASIK on them, followed them for a year, published this in the Journal of Refractive Surgery with 1-year follow-up with astigmatic results that are the same between controls and the test eyes. So this meant effectively almost a 10% increase in surgical volume of a clinic screening for cases. Suddenly, it became very interesting to do mapping of the epithelium without a water bath. And, you know, my dear friend, David Han, we had lunch yesterday. We met at Arvo in 1991. He was using OCT, I was using ultrasound. It was a very exciting time. And he went and immediately made it possible for the RT View, and of course now the Avanti, and so on, to do epithelial mapping. Well, I got a prototype in 2012. But of course now there are multiple devices, and many of them, 3 of them, FDA approved. Go figure. And so this has now become, you know, ubiquitous. In my clinic, I have, you know, 10 units. One of them is at my desk because I consider this to be the slit lamp of the 20th century and this the slit lamp of the 21st century. I actually use it in clinic directly while I'm looking at patients. But one of the secrets, I would say, for the young investigators of a career like this is that you should find something that no one thinks is of any use, and it passes through the 3 stages that Schopenhauer described of first being completely ignored, second, violently opposed, and third, accepted as inherently obvious. And during the first phase and second phase, I managed to publish 45 papers on the epithelium alone. And of course, this led to an understanding as to how the epithelium behaves. And the first rule was, quite simply, if there's irregular astigmatism, there's irregular epithelium. Because if an eye presents with irregular topography, by definition, the epithelium has compensated as much as it can, leaving irregularity on the surface. So, apart from understanding that the epithelium fills depressions described by Vogt in his 1921 textbook on the slit lamp, it thins over peaks. The change is proportional to how much stromal change it is, and it's very dependent on the rate of change of curvature. Paulo Vinciguerra also talking a lot about this. So people say that I'm really a very shallow person because I spent all of this time just on the epithelium. But if we look at keratoconus screening, apart from epithelial map, we've had, you know, essentially a multimodal approach, which is introduced by Renato as a concept, and you know, we have, you know, similar scores from Damien Gatinel, Paulo Vinciguerra and his father and his son, adding the biomechanical element with Cynthia Roberts, obviously the epithelium, and now we have all of that in one device in a 1.5-second scan, thanks to Francesco Versace. So, what does this mean? It means that we've got not only epithelial mass, but now I get a little deeper, and we're going into the anatomy of the cornea. This is a slide from a 1999 ASCRS publication, presentation, where I was talking about how everyone thinks that this is of no use, but I'm sure that Röntgen, sitting in the audience with the physicians or surgeons at the time, would have been told, I don't need an X-ray because I can feel the bone and I can put it straight without an X-ray. But knowing the anatomy is the key to fixing complications. I mean, it's the simple basics of medicine, you know, diagnostics and then therapeutics. So one of our earliest therapeutic cases, after years of looking at complications and having no idea what to do about them, was this patient with a very complex refractive history that resulted in a highly irregular stromal surface with a very regular corneal surface. And as you can see, the epithelial map had like an array lens sitting on the stroma, and the man literally said, my vision is waxy. He was an engineer from NASA that came from Florida to London. We did a transepithelial PT and smoothed out the stromal surface. The epithelium regrew as a smooth surface. The topography was regularized, the aberrations went down, and his contrast went to normal. So Looking at the stromal difference map, we could see that the stromal was removed exactly where the epithelium was thin. So in other words, no topography guided, just PTK available on your friendly Visix 2020B in 1995. Now, let's move on to the genius. Because this textbook, if you just look at the index, was the Bible. I happen to speak Spanish because I grew up in Mexico, 1980 textbook, and I read it cover to cover. I went and stayed in Bogota for a month with Carmen Barraquer and José Ignacio, and I presented some of my work. He congratulated me. I still have my notes from watching Carmen operate, you know, assembles the microkeratome herself, you know, stuff like that. And, you know, I had this book dedicated to me. It was, you know, obviously a very encouraging moment. But I also have to mention that in that same South American trip, I spent time with Maria Clara and Roberto Saldívar, as you mentioned, and my corneal fellowship with Simon Holland, and my refractive surgery fellowship with Hugo Sutton, who gave me an extraordinary experience during that time. Barraquer's genius was hard to understand. I mean, the amount of invention that he had to create to do what he wanted to do is almost superhuman. If you think about all of the experimental work that he did on rabbits, developing, you know, burrs and, you know, eventually the idea of a microkeratome, and then the optics and calculating the trigonometry, which was then aided by the earliest, you know, computers. This is really crazy for someone who went to medical school. Do you not agree? And the Instituto Barraquer de América became a magnet for people all over the world to come and learn this incredible technique, which took about 40 minutes to 60 minutes to do, and it was very complex. One of the disciples, this young man here, in the spirit of Barraquer, became a teacher, and he taught all of us. I went to the LASIK course 3 times before I did my first procedure. And from this group of disciples, let's say, we end up here. We end up with the procedure that is the most commonly performed surgical procedure on the planet, with the highest safety, the most publications, the most science around it, and it's an enhancement of, you know, human function that is hard to understand. Let's move on to ICL sizing, because this is another area which is really critical because we have a phenomenal technology, but it has an ongoing problem with sizing. And we all know what the problems are. Even with the Aquaport, we still do see some development of cataract. And so the key to this, I am convinced, is revealing the posterior chamber. The anterior chamber, the angle to angle can be the same as the sulcus, but it can be smaller than the sulcus, but it can be bigger than the sulcus, and then there are cysts. So these are mysteries that you cannot uncover by looking in front of the iris. And Carlo Visolo came up to me at the ASRS in 1999 and said, I need one of these devices. We got him a prototype. Carlo wrote the textbook, a 400-page textbook on the ICL in 1999. We worked together and showed unequivocally that sulcus to sulcus-based measurements were a planet apart from using white to white. Unfortunately, as many of you know, he had a glioblastoma and he lived another year, left his lovely family behind, and left us to continue the work in London without him, Tim and Ryan. We discovered that the ciliary body inner diameter combined with the sulcus to sulcus lens rise and the scotovic pupil actually leads to a formula that doesn't include the sulcus to sulcus anymore and surpasses the predictive power of what the volt will be based on the size of the ICL being inserted. This, in comparison to all of the formulas at the time, shows really the smallest range of post-op results, the smallest interquartile range, and really the best possible predictive power. For example, we've got 61% of eyes within 100 microns of predicted and 96% within 300. Now, of course, OCT is very good, but not nearly as good. And let's not mention that white to white, of course, is a very primitive way of sizing the ICL. So We're now in the era of AI, and it is extraordinary to see all these beautiful publications using anterior segment OCT. Soon, I'm sure, a publication from the Saldivars. But white-to-white is step one. Yes, we will reduce the scatter of the results by using more measurements, like the whole anterior segment in front of the iris. But we won't get to the Holy Grail until we look behind the iris. And that's because without that, we won't be dealing or finding the outliers. And it's the outliers that we don't want to see. So while white-to-white continues to be good, it's no question to me that if you're going to be inserting ICLs, you really need to have an anterior segment OCT. But if you want to go to the top level and really avoid as many, and you can't avoid all of them because it's biology, but avoid as many lens exchanges as possible, we're going to have to look behind the iris. And of interest is that Professor Izbeska in Warsaw asked me if the formula could be used with a handheld ultrasound device. She did a big study with 180 patients or 120 patients' eyes, and unfortunately, the answer was no. So the resolution of 30 megahertz, often called 50 on the brochures, but they're really 30. The resolution isn't sufficient to get the accuracy of the posterior chamber measurements to take advantage of the ciliary body inner diameter predictive value. The step two in sizing is really recognizing that the haptics don't end up always in the same place, the foot plates. And this is from one of our studies. My son did a summer project, which is now submitted for publication, where we used the intraoperative OCT to measure the volt and see if we could predict the postoperative volt later on. Actually, two studies have been done which showed that it wasn't possible to predict it adequately. But those were univariate studies, and Max did a multivariate regression and found a formula that can predict the post-op volt at 1 month within 320 microns in 100% of eyes. And this was, we did a model development, and then we did a forward testing of the model. So we're pretty confident that this is the second way. And finally, obviously, post-op, you can have asymmetrically inserted foot plates. And so being able to make a map of the volt with ultrasound is of great use, because remember that the thickest part of the lens in high myopia is not visible. It's behind the iris. So the only way of seeing it is to dilate the pupil, which makes the lens go forward. So the only way you can know how close the lens is to the ICL is to the crystalline lens is by ultrasound. We come to perhaps the biggest impact element that I worked on, which is this idea of working on the cornea for presbyopia correction. And it has been, not easy to be a part of the debate between whether presbyopia should be corrected on the cornea or the lens. It turns out it's almost like two planets. It's almost like Star Trek without the universal translator, talking completely different languages across each other without being able to really converge at all. And I'll propose to you that it is not like two planets. It's actually like 3 planets. But it's not cornea and lens. It's multifocality, monovision, or spherical aberration-induced depth of field. And this is something that we bumped into serendipitously when we were trying to correct night vision disturbances in the early 2000s with wavefront-guided treatments. We had patients that were treated with spherical profiles with high spherical aberration, in whom we did they obviously had night vision disturbances in low contrast. We measured the wavefront, put it on the eye, and got a reduction in spherical aberration. Now, as a control group, we looked at patients that were treated with aspheric profiles, in whom also the spherical aberration went up, but not to the extent where the contrast sensitivity changed. Even with the modest reduction in spherical aberration that we got with wavefront-guided treatments, we still got them to get normal contrast. So right there was, wait a minute, you can leave spherical aberration in the eye and still have a high contrast? That's not what optical scientists would say. The brain is filtering spherical aberration. And so we looked at the amount of spherical aberration we ended up post-op, and that was 0.56 microns. And that's where this magic 0.6 microns comes from. Later on, of course, all of the labs with adaptive optics, of which there weren't that many, were starting to check how spherical aberration could change depth of field. And Carolina, she beautifully demonstrated that whether either positive spherical aberration or negative spherical aberration will increase the depth of field. And this was entirely in concert with what we had observed, which is that essentially you can have a therapeutic dose of spherical aberration, which would increase depth of field. But if you have too much, well, then you have low contrast night vision disturbances and you don't get an increase in depth of field. So based on this principle, we're saying that you can do spherical aberration modification of depth of field both on the cornea or the lens. It doesn't matter. The question is, where should you do it? And everyone's seen, the results of Presbyopia. They are, of course, benefiting from the extraordinary accuracy of LASIK, which is, much more accurate than lens calculations, perhaps not as accurate as lens adjustments, post-op light adjustable lenses, but really accurate. And now there are, I think, more than 15 publications, including one that we published a couple of years ago in Commercial Pilots, which is now approved by the CAA in the UK as the method of treating presbyopia. Now, it goes without saying that when you teach about this, it's quite convincing. And even surgeons who would come for the SMILE part of the course would sit through the presbyopia day and then ask to be operated on, which I would then make them wait until the next course so that we did it 2 or 3 days before the next course, and then they would present their mental process and their experience in having presbyopia themselves. But one of the greatest side benefits for me has been that I've now operated on, essentially most of my jazz idols. And this makes for a very beautiful relationship where I've given something back to them after only paying $15 for a record that I played 1,000 times. And they probably only got $1 for that. So it's been a wonderful circle. Myself, 8 years ago, my refraction sort of slightly myopicized over time, but I now see like when I was 20 years old. I have plano minus 175, but my 175i sees 20/50, and I'm binocular, 20/10, J3 at intermediate and J1 at near, with 40 seconds of uncorrected stereo because it's a modification of binocular vision with highest contrast. So not only do I see the way I was when I was 20, but obviously I don't look like that, and I certainly don't have the same shape, but I feel that way. And what we've seen now in the industry is a prediction that I made about 10 years ago at the ISOP in a talk, where multifocality is shifting over to spherical aberration, both on the cornea and on the lens. And we see these new lenses now essentially imitating what we were doing 20 years ago on the cornea. Finally, it goes without saying, huge project, SMILE. Started off very difficult, a massive amount of work and complication repair that we had to do initially to get things going. But thankfully, that turned into probably, I think, what is 157 pages of this textbook on complications, so that none of you have to go through that arduous pathway ever again. But I would encourage you to start by reading it. This is an incredibly mature procedure. Everything has been worked out, the centration, the cyclotorsion, treating low myopia, cylinder correction, what instrumentation works, the exact specific standard operating procedures for the surgical technique, energy settings, suction loss, intraoperative complications, post-op complications that are different from LASIK, and of course, retreatments. And of course, this is really, in terms of time of release, possibly one of the most published procedures in the history of medicine, with over 1,000 publications in a procedure that's really only been commercially available for 12 years. Now, all, the 3 stages of Schopenhauer, right? And the 3 stages, ignored, violently opposed, accepted as inherently obvious. If I was having a beer with Arthur, I would be saying, hey, Art, there's actually a 4th stage. And he'd say, what is that, Dan? And I would say, well, the 4th stage is everyone thinks it was their idea. And we now have great, wonderful followers now. Of course, with the hindsight and the benefit of the really hard work and, let's say, tens of thousands of man-hours in developing everything that you saw on the previous slide. So if I can indulge here for a second, I started in the 90s, with black hair, publishing on high-frequency ultrasound on the cornea. And when I started my clinic, I hired someone straight out of his computer science degree, master's from Cambridge, having done mathematics at Oxford, Tim Archer. The combination was, significantly higher than the sum of its parts. We've had Maureen, Ryan, and now Ruchi and Joseph in the team. And I think you could agree that for a team of 6 people, this is quite a lot of productivity. But let's put it into perspective, because while this looks impressive, I want to put it into perspective. Professor Jorge Alio, one of my great friends sitting here, that's another planet. Nevertheless, we are a part of everyone that surrounds us, because it's the interactions, it's the relationships, it's the collaboration. And our work family is really something special to me. Craig Engelfried was at boarding school with me when I was 12, and we serendipitously met in 2002. And he agreed to stay for 3 months in London to help me start a clinic. I knew nothing about business. And 22 years later, he's still with me, and a great friend, and I love him. And he really did the whole of the business side, and I just did the surgery. And I want to also thank Glenn Karp, who was my first fellow in London, and of course is now my partner, and has been an unbelievable support throughout with my work family. And I'll finish with, of course, my blood family. A couple of members who aren't in the picture anymore, but this picture was taken in 2021, a month before my father passed away at 89 with Presbyopia. And I want to thank everyone very much for your attention, and I hope that that summarizes it all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. That was absolutely remarkable. In your style, you delivered, an eloquent lecture, just a bit over time, but we're going to excuse you this time. And on behalf of the International Society of Refractive Surgery, we would like to bestow upon you the José Ignacio Barraquer Medal. This is the highest honor of our society. Let's get it.
All right, so, I know everyone is so excited to be here to celebrate all that you have contributed to our field. And as I mentioned earlier, please come and ask your questions, text in your questions. But, you've started from such a young age. I had no idea that this was even before you entered into ophthalmology. But what was your motivation? What continues to drive you,
Insecurity? To be honest, insecurity is a very interesting component of the human experience. It's like spherical aberration. In the right doses, it's an incredible source of energy and drive and lack of finality and satisfaction. You achieve something and it's like, wow, that is so cool. Right, we got to go on to this next thing now. It lasts minutes, okay, this prize is going to last for the rest of my life, but I'm just saying, and so I think that's it can of course be paralyzing if it's too much. And not just paralyzing, but destroying, soul destroying. But what's interesting about research, and the young people out there listening, I had no interest in research. My father was a pharmaceutical researcher, but I had no interest in research. I had interest in doing surgery. And as a foreign graduate, trying to get into a US residency in New York, because that's where the jazz is, I had to do some research. And I was told that's kind of the way to do it. And so, all right then. And I had interviewed at Cornell the first time around and didn't get into the residency program. And I asked Jack Coleman if he would, have me as a research fellow. And he said, we really don't have any funding now. This was like in March when the match results came out. And he said, but if you're going to be in New York anytime, stop by. And I said, well, that's kind of funny because I'm actually in New York next Monday. He said, oh, well, I'll just hand you on to Eleni and maybe she can arrange to bring you around to the lab. Okay. So I put the phone down, picked it up and dialed British Airways and said, yes, I'd like a flight to New York, please, on Sunday. Literally slept on a couch of a jazz musician friend of mine and showed up at the lab, and I was interviewed by Ron and Mark. And we hit it off. I loved computing and three-dimensional imaging, and it was right up my alley. So I did it as a means to an end. But having had this wow moment, with finding something that had never been measured before, it gave me some kind of intrigue. And little by little, I became enamored with the process of not understanding something. Even to this day, we have clinical cases that I've never seen that before. Someone just walked up to me with an example of a case he sent me, and I said, look, I've never seen that before, but maybe it's this. And turns out it was that. So we don't look for problems. We don't look to generate problems as surgeons. But the personality of a refractive surgeon is one who can handle repetition without being bored, who loves repetition, like a classical musician. Same piece every night, but is not fazed by a curveball. You don't go crazy, your hands don't start shaking, you start paralyzed. You're someone who can take a unknown and approach it logically using all of your experience and sometimes some gut feeling. So I think that's really what it was, and I became a consummate researcher without realizing that that's what I wanted to do.
So you bring up a great point. So insecurity drives you to continue to innovate and to continue to strive with that curiosity. And then you brought up 3 amazing tenets, which can really help you to innovate and become Dan Reinstein. You have a white space, then you have an idea, or you discover something or a concept that is then violently opposed, right? So you have insecurity and then concepts which are then violently opposed. How do you continue to push forth, knowing to say, okay, I'm going to keep on going? Because even with concepts, even with ideas that we ideate and action upon, we know that 1 in 12 can actually become commercialized, and that's a long journey.
Yes.
So provide that food for thought, those pearls, so that people who are doing what you do can continue to work.
We're in a room of like-minded and like personalities. We're all the same here. So your question as to what keeps you going when there's a failure or a roadblock, well, I think we all know it, because I cannot believe that if we didn't go through every single one of you, there wasn't a massive disappointment, a lot of struggle. None of us went through our careers to get to where we are today without being able to push through a negative experience. And Renato is very adept in philosophy, but I'm sure people must have described this already. But using a failure to fuel the striving to overcome the failure is, I don't know what you'd call that, but that's the feature. It's not giving up. My brother is a filmmaker, and I don't know if any of you saw his film Skin in 2009, Sofia Canedo, about a girl who was born in South Africa with a bit of curly hair from some white Afrikaans parents, and she was reclassified colored when she went to boarding school, and then she wasn't able to live with her family because you can't live having it colored in the house. And the father, the motto of the movie is never give up. So it's one of these things where, and her father eventually reclassified her to white in the Supreme Court of South Africa. Of course, too late because she's already integrated into the black community. And it was really a tragic story, a real tearjerker. But it's a never give up. Would you all agree? Never give up. Never give up.
Then, congratulations. It was a very inspiring lecture, and we were all fortunate to have this lecture as a Barraquer lecture. Thank you so much. I just want to ask you one question about, you talk about therapeutic refractive surgery, and I learned that concept from you. And we know that the penetration of LASIK, while it's a marvelous procedure, one of the most studied, maybe the most studied elective medical procedure, and the penetration is so low.
Yeah.
Because of fear.
Yeah.
And fear of a complication.
Yes.
How we can respond to that.
Yes.
With all these technologies that you have brought us.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm at stage 2 of my answer to that question. It's violently opposed, but I'll throw it out there for you. I wrote this in an editorial that is published in the Journal of Refractive Surgery. Think of it this way. The market penetrance of corneal refractive surgery is 1%. 1% of the potential candidates. Now, I've asked industry moguls, investors, how much do you think has been invested in grossly speaking, in refractive surgery? It's all private funded. There's no government funding for refractive surgery. And he said, probably 20 billion. Now, show me an investor who's going to put 20 billion in for 1% market share of the potential client base. No one. Now look at this scientifically. When you look at a normal distribution, everything in biology is distributed normally. 0.5% at one end and 0.5% at the other end are outside of 3 standard deviations, right? 3 standard deviations is normal, and the 1% on the outside is abnormal. So you could say that the people that have had surgery so far are abnormal. They're the ones who pushed through this barrier of fear. What if? Well, what if? I need my eyes. I'm a pilot. I clean houses. I have to see the dust. So how do we get past that? And that's why, my theory is that until we can provide reliable therapeutic tools that don't require 30 years of research to have the knowledge to use them, topography-guided transepithelial PTK, until we can provide this to the accomplished, experienced refractive surgeon, but not expert in therapeutic, we will have this problem. Because when we give informed consent, we talk about the 1 in 1,000 chance of losing 2 lines of best spectacle corrected vision in lay terms. And we equate it to the same risk being, for example, wearing daily disposables, the most safe contact lenses that you can get, for 3 years. But that risk is spread over a lifetime of poking your eye twice a day, 600 times a year. The surgery happens on the day. And if you look at psychological studies of risk perception in humans, the same amount of risk spread over a long time is perceived as less than if it's done on a specific moment. And so unless we can give, and I do give informed consent about the 1 in 1,000 loss of 2 lines, but that I can also say that in my career, and that our combined career of Glenn Karp and myself at this clinic, we have a rate of 0.04 loss of 2 lines because of the therapeutic work that we can do. And we're treating with LASIK from +7 to -16. And that's all of those eyes included. So it is an exceedingly safe procedure with a safety net, or it can be. And so I really believe that see, the problem with the therapeutic is that it's not a business. The complications are so rare that companies aren't going to invest really in a product that's only for 1 in 1,000 patients. They can't charge enough for that one procedure. So it's going to have to be like an airbag, you know. I remember when it cost extra to put the airbags in. In fact, I remember playing with my brother in the back of my father's Barracuda in 1967 in Mexico City. No seatbelts. It was totally fine. But you can't buy a car without multiple airbags now. Even if it's a Fiat 500, it has multiple airbags. It's a given. I believe that refractive surgery needs to become the specialty that has airbags as well as wheels.
With the refractive surgery, you know, you're kind of showing that there is that spectrum where there's the highly refractive, which it's therapeutic, but it gives that freedom to the truly therapeutic needs, where people having it, it provides this extra, because they can't use contact lenses, et cetera. So it certainly spans that spectrum. But in collaborating and innovating, there's also that ethical and moral responsibility. I remember when I first came out of fellowship training, I even thought to myself, it's really hard to say, you know, I know this patient can get to 20/20 with just a -2, -3. Do I really want to do refractive surgery from the get-go, or do I just want to start with just doing PTK for a while? Because it's this ethical responsibility. Yeah. It's a whole nother level when you are actually innovating and pushing that. So how do you balance that inner ethical responsibility, especially in the realm of refractive surgery as an innovator?
Yeah, my way of doing that was a bit embarrassing to admit. I let others be more pioneering than me. I would tend to only get to try something unless I was absolutely convinced it was going to work, and then possibly fail. So we're sitting in the room here with Yanni Palikaris and Jorge Alio, some of the originals, right? And José Ignacio Barraquer is the quintessential daredevil.
Amazing, right.
Because when you think about the idea of slicing the anterior 2/3 of the cornea off, putting it in nitrogen, getting in your car, driving to your house where you have the lathe, lathing it, driving back to the OR at the hospital, thawing it, suturing it on the cornea. I mean, who's like, that's the informed consent. Would you like it? Who's going to say yes? So I mean, there are pioneers like Hugo Sutton ahead of me. One of the serendipitous elements of my fellowship was that he was a very early adopter of LASIK. And he'd done the heaviest hitter in New York when I left New York had done 200 LASIK procedures when I left. He had done 6,000 in Vancouver. But that also means he had the library of horrors under his belt. And the love story started when he saw me presenting as a resident this ultrasound device. He said, if you ever want a fellowship, call me. And I put that prototype that, you know, that I was being scanned in on the floor there with the wires coming out into a suitcase and took it to Vancouver. And we started scanning his patients, clueless about what we were looking at when we were first looking at the scans. I mean, like, what's going on here? There's all these lines everywhere. And eventually starting to learn the anatomy of a complication. So we have to have some people like that. I'm a bit chicken. I'm not one of those. But I think we need all kinds of personalities. Those who can handle Lucio Burato. Think about it. You know, yeah.
That's right. Levels of invincibility and highly risk averse versus less, but the contributions that you have made are not just incremental, they truly are disruptive. So thank you so much.
Disruptive, that's a good one for me.
In a positive way.
In more ways than one, yes, thank you.
And then, please.
Just one quick question. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your work in Nepal? Because I think that is so powerful and really inspirational. So just as a closing question to go ahead and to speak about that.
Do you know, it's something that I haven't publicized, I haven't written articles about, I've never done an ocular surgery news article about. It was It was a labor of love. I was thinking about it when I was medical director of LASIK Vision, pariah of the industry for working for a discounter, but doing scientific work among 60 surgeons, 100,000 procedures in 1 year, and all of that. And I wrote to the WHO because they had just started the 2020 project in 1998. I wrote to them and I said, your website doesn't have anything on refractive error. And 50% of visual impairment in the world is because people can't afford a pair of glasses or they don't have access to glasses. And I said, I'm surprised that you're only looking at cataract, glaucoma, trachoma. You're not looking at the biggest problem in the world, which is refractive error. And I never got a response. 2 years later, my father was in Geneva working with an NGO, pharmaceutical, and someone walked up to him and said, are you the Dr. Reinstein that wrote to us about vision? And he said, no, that'll be my son. And I was talking to everybody about this. Like, this is what refractive surgery was experimented on the rich so that we can give it to those who can't afford glasses. And it's ready. And as it happens, Jeff Tabin was at his own celebration party for a huge award that he got in Atlanta at the Academy. George Waring threw a party at his house. Yes, I had a band and I played the whole evening, but at the end I put the horn down and Jeff was still there, drinking and, and playing his harmonica. And we started talking. And he said, you know, Tilganga, we've really wanted to start a refractive surgery program, but we tried, it just hasn't. I said, Jeff, I so want to do this. I cannot tell you. We shook hands. We had a meeting in Europe a few months later, where in a ski resort, where he demonstrated that he can walk up a mountain and ski down it in the time it takes me to go up the ski lift. And we started this idea of attaching a refractive surgery unit to Tilganga. Tilganga, his brainchild with Sanduk Ruit, 5,000 square foot facility built mostly with US aid money. Sometimes our money does go abroad for good causes. And then, I mean, these are angels on earth, these people doing too much humanitarian surgery and always left in debt. And so the idea was to say, well, can we use refractive surgery, even in one of the poorest countries in the world, to generate profit that would either make a self-sustaining cost recovery model for refractive surgery. People come up to the clinic, they don't know why they can't see. They're told, you can't see because you need glasses. How much are the glasses? $10. I don't have $10. Okay, come this way. Go to the refractive surgery unit, lie down, 3 hours later, you can see. End of discussion, right? But the project started off that way, and we, you know, I was saying that Kishore Pradhan, who was our fellow for a year before starting this, he was operating with a MEL 80 with topography guided and Presbyond and a Visimax 500 doing flaps and SMILE. And this is in the poorest country in the world, second poorest country in the world. And I would say he's operating at a higher technological standard than a surgeon in Beverly Hills. And that goes to the discussion about the FDA, which is a whole other thing. But you know, that was the idea, was to say, let's not do this hodgepodge. Let's do this at the highest possible standard. We trained him to the hilt. We observed him. We set up our EMR in Nepal, so we had the ability to communicate, look at his cases, review scans. And there we are. We published his first 1,500 eyes first, and then we published a paper, which you can read in the Journal of Cataract and Refractive Surgery, on how we did it. How did we do this? You know, what were the components? And Jeff, of course, being, you know, Superman energy level, nuclear radiation energy man, and you know, my little ability to have enough money to contribute to buy these lasers from Zeiss and make the thing happen. It was a resounding success. We're actually finally doing our second unit, and this is going to be in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. The lasers are ordered. Daniel Mulatu is trained, and we're about to start the same thing. Again, one of the poorest countries in the world, 80 million people with, I don't know, 100 ophthalmologists. You know, it's a really dire sort of ophthalmological field. So that's the idea. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for mentioning it.
Thank you.
Goodness.
Thank you.
That is really an aspirational anecdote, and you are truly an inspirational speaker, and just everything that you represent everything that embodies the Barraquer medal. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.